Welcome and thank you for joining us for the fourth event in the OSS Society's Oh So Social Conversation Series. The inspiration for the name of this month-long series was drawn from the fact that so many members of OSS were listed in the social register. It was said its initials really stood for Oh So Social. And for this reason, we're asking everyone gathered tonight not to practice social distancing. Instead, in honor of the OSS, we'd like everyone gathered tonight to practice what we like to call Oh So Social distancing. Because we could not hold the Donovan Award dinner this year, we wanted to use this virtual format to keep our OSS family together. And we're honored to bring together leading figures from the intelligence and special operations communities to discuss critical national security issues. We're very fortunate tonight to have two of the most respected leaders from the intelligence community, Dr. Michael Vickers and Michael Morrell, the former acting director of CIA. And I'd like to thank our series sponsor, Fiserv, the sponsor of tonight's events, BCG, In-Q-Tel, and Zignal Labs, and our OSO social patrons for their generous support. And I'd also like to thank our media sponsor, the Cipher Brief, and to the hundreds of people who are with us tonight, including members of the intelligence and special operations communities, the military service academies, representatives from the intelligence and armed services committees, the amazing women in intelligence, and senior government officials. Thank you for supporting the OSS Society and for your service. Before this evening's discussion begins, I'd like to spend a few minutes showing you the OSS Society's most ambitious project, building the National Museum of Intelligence and Special Operations. Eventually, programs such as tonight's will be held in the museum's OSO Social Club, a bar that will serve as a gathering place for the special operations and intelligence communities, because as a special operator once told me, every operation starts or ends in a bar. And I'd like to show you a brief video about the museum. We'd welcome your support in making this vision a reality.
I used to look at the pictures of the people in the OSS, the guys that were in Detachment 101 or that were the Jedburghs, were the people that were the foundation of the OSS, our history. And I always used to look at the faces and I looked at the eyes. And what dawned on me was, there's no difference between those people that were doing that as the greatest generation and the people that are doing it now. There's the same commitment, there's the same belief in country, there's the same love of what this nation stands for. Basically look at somebody and say, you need somebody to go? Send me. I'm your person.
The glorious amateurs from World War II's Office of Strategic Services have become today's quiet professionals of the U.S. intelligence and special operations communities. The National Museum of Intelligence and Special Operations will honor Americans who have served as our nation's first line of defense. It will educate the public about the importance of intelligence and special operations to the preservation of freedom, and inspire future generations to serve. It will be a museum unlike any other, immersing visitors in what it takes to answer our nation's call. We have a unique opportunity to pay tribute to the silent warriors who fight in the shadows for us.
By the very nature of their work, these silent warriors of the intelligence and special operations communities do their job out of public view. Their actions are vital to protecting our national security. The National Museum of Intelligence and Special Operations will tell their story of sacrifice and dedication and bravery. I ask you to join me in supporting this important effort. America needs this museum. The spearhead points the way forward in the past, the present, and the future.
Find out how you can help make this museum a reality and honor those who keep us safe.
If you've been tuning in to the OSO Social Conversation series for the past few weeks, every week we have one drink, but tonight we have two, and there's a reason for that. The presidential debate is starting in about 3 hours, and we figured everyone could use at least two drinks before we watch it. And that's why I'm so honored to introduce noted author and cocktail historian Philip Green. If you've attended the Donovan Award dinner in years past, you'll recognize Phil as the OSS Society's bartender, where he's presented the evening's cocktail from behind our replica of the bar from the Hotel Ritz in Paris that Ernest Hemingway and Colonel David Bruce liberated in 1944. We could not ask for a better red bartender. Phil's the author of To Have and Have Another, a Hemingway cocktail companion, A Drinkable Feast, a cocktail companion to 1920s Paris, and The Manhattan, the story of the first modern cocktail. When he's not writing books about cocktails, Phil is the trademark counsel for the U.S. Marine Corps, and we're pleased to have him offer two cocktails this evening, the Manhattan and the Bloody Mary. The recipe for tonight's cocktails were sent to you with the evening's meeting link. We hope that you'll prepare this evening's cocktail along with Phil, and please join me in welcoming.
Thank you, Charles. It used to be General Hugo that would steal my jokes. May he rest in peace, and I miss him dearly. You took my joke about the needing two drinks, one to whet the appetite for this stimulating discussion on the future of intelligence, and the second one to maybe numb the senses for the maybe not so intelligent debate that'll happen later in the evening. But yes, we're doing two drinks this evening that have ties to the OSS, the Manhattan and the Bloody Mary. We'll start with the Manhattan, a more sophisticated cocktail that probably has never been invented aside from the martini, but it was the Manhattan that was the predecessor of the martini. It was the first drink invented circa 1874 to establish as that classic platform spirit of some sort, gin, whiskey, what have you, rum, scotch, then a fortified wine such as vermouth or a wine of that sort, vermouth, fortified, aromatized wine, and then bitters. So those three components are found in drinks like the Rob Roy, Scotch Manhattan, basically, the Manhattan, the Martinez, Martini, and so many other great drinks from the 20th and 19th and 21st century, the Negroni, the Vesper, which we'll talk about next week. Ian Fleming will work his way into my toast. The El Presidente, the Churchill, the Vieux Carré, so many great drinks were created using vermouth, which was introduced by the Manhattan. So you've heard Charles refer often to the claim that OSS didn't really stand for Office of Strategic Services, it stood for OSO Social. And to quote the Atlantic Monthly, referring to the Manhattan Club and the OSS, to quote the Atlantic Monthly on the OSS, needing to throw together an agency quickly, Donovan turned to his circle of friends in New York and hired blue bloods by the dozen. The OSS roster was lousy with Mellons, DuPonts, Morgans, and Vanderbilts. Columnists joked that the agency's initials actually stood for OSO Social. In Donovan's defense, hiring aristocrats did make some sense on some level. They usually spoke several languages and knew Europe well, but holidays on the Riviera were a far cry from war. As one reporter noted, knowing how to speak French in a tuxedo didn't necessarily prepare recruits for parachuting into enemy territory or blowing up bridges. So according to cocktail history, not to mention my book on the Manhattan was probably invented at the Manhattan Club, one of the great social clubs, OSO social clubs of New York in the Gilded Age. Circa 1874, now, the Manhattan Club stood at the corner of 5th Avenue and 15th Street downtown. It was housed within a building known as the Bankard Mansion and featured silk stocking democracy attending receptions in the par excellence swallowtail coat, white choker, and light kid gloves. Sounds like Donovan's home place. The Bankard House days when New Yorkers all knew each other and there was much time for social intercourse are said to have been the most social years of the Manhattan Club. So one of the scions of the Manhattan Club in the late 19th century was financier Leonard Jerome, whose house at 26th and Madison Avenue became the second home of the club in the 1890s. According to cocktail folklore, it was his daughter Jenny Jerome who invented the Manhattan in December of 1874. It was to be part of a party at the Manhattan Club celebrating the 1874 gubernatorial election in New York of Samuel Tilden. Unfortunately, this story doesn't align with facts because Jenny Jerome wasn't in Manhattan in December of 1874 when the party was actually took place. She was across the pond in London giving birth to her son Winston. I should have mentioned Jenny Jerome's married name. It was Churchill. Indeed, Jenny Jerome, the alleged mother of the Manhattan, was Winston Churchill's mother. Whether or not she left a recipe before she got on the steamship to head across the pond, we'll never know. Isn't it funny how Churchill's name seems to always come up in these discussions of spycraft and cocktails? Of course, another one of the great New York families of Manhattan were the Astors. And in 1904, John Jacob Astor IV, who tragically died on the Titanic in April of 1912, he opened the luxurious St. Regis Hotel in 1904. His son, Vincent Astor, became a confidant of FDR, and at one time he was believed to be FDR's choice to run the OSS. Didn't happen that way. So when the director of British Security Coordination, a Canadian businessman named William Stevenson, when he came to New York to set up the BSC, which was British intelligence outposts here in the U.S., Astor said to him, "You need to come live at my broken down boarding house, the St. Regis Hotel." So it was right around the corner from the headquarters of the BSC, the British Security Coordination, on the 36th floor of the Rockefeller Center. Now, Donovan ended up meeting Stevenson, Big Bill and Little Bill, or Big Bill and Wild Bill. They met for the first time in the St. Regis Hotel's iconic King Cole Bar. And another important meeting took place there in 1941. Two officials from MI6, the British security agency, came over to meet with Stevenson and Donovan, and their names were Admiral John Godfrey and a protege of his named Ian Fleming. Now, you might have heard the name Ian Fleming. He wrote that book called Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, and I think maybe another book or two, I can't remember. But anyway, they all met for drinks at the King Cole Bar, and Donovan and Stevenson would meet at the King Cole Bar just about every week for the balance of the war, and they celebrated VE Day, Victory over Europe, at the St. Regis at the end of hostilities in Europe. Now, praising Stevenson's role in helping shape the modern American intelligence community, Donovan later said, "Bill Stevenson taught us all we ever knew about foreign intelligence." So the partnership between Donovan and Stevenson, forged over drinks at the St. Regis, proved not only to be one of the most important alliances of the war, but also one of the defining relationships of modern espionage. It's also important to note that the aforementioned Ian Fleming, who had come to New York with Admiral John Godfrey, the head of British Naval Intelligence, to worked with Donovan to create a blueprint for the OSS. So he had his hands, literally his fingerprints, on the original document creating the OSS. Fleming was also a big fan of the St. Regis and the King Cole Bar, of course. In fact, in his 1950s novel, Live and Let Die, he has James Bond having drinks with Felix Leiter of the CIA at the King Cole Bar. Lastly, Hollywood director and OSS officer John Ford famously described William Wild Bill Donovan as the sort of guy who thought nothing of parachuting into France, blowing up a bridge, pissing in Luftwaffe gas tanks, then dancing on the roof of the St. Regis with a German spy. So for an evening celebrating an oh-so-social organizations, it makes sense to toast with one of the most social and society-associated drinks of all time, a drink very much associated with the St. Regis. It was one of the house drinks. Let's toast with the Manhattan cocktail. So here's how. Now you notice I always start with a chilled glass. This is my OSS glass. We're going to start with, I'm using Redemption Rye this evening. We'll use bourbon or rye. Earliest recipes going back to the 1870s and 1880s call for either rye or bourbon, so I don't know if there's a correct spirit to use. So I'm going to use about 3 ounces of rye whiskey. Now, early recipes for the Manhattan were usually 1-to-1 vermouth to whiskey, and sometimes they were 2-to-1 vermouth to whiskeys, which nowadays people call a reverse Manhattan. I usually make mine about 2 to 1. So here's an ounce of sweet vermouth. And you have to have bitters for it to be a proper Manhattan. I'm using Angostura, but I'm also using, because my ancestor Antoine Peychaud invented them back in New Orleans in the 1850s, I'm using Peychaud's bitters as well. So you want to use plenty of ice. Because you want the drink to be very cold, but you also want a little bit of dilution. Hope you all are making this at home. That's enough. The glass is nicely chilled. Strain it into, now you can shake a Manhattan if you want. You can shake a martini if you want. The rule of thumb is a drink that's going to come out clear, you don't want it to be cloudy, so you want to shake, stir it. But if you want to shake it, I'm not going to call the police on you. Now, you can use as a garnish either a nice lemon peel, which I'm going to do, or a nice cherry. Don't use the store-bought cherries. Use something like Amarena Fabri or Luxardo, a real maraschino cocktail cherry. And if you want to do a little flavor, you get your lemon peel like this and a lighter, and there you go. You get some of those essential oils out of the peel. And our first drink of the evening, folks, I give you the Manhattan. Cheers. All right, so now put that aside. On to our second drink, which maybe you want to put in the fridge for the debate. The next drink also has the St. Regis King Cole Bar connection, but also a link to the city of light, Paris, and a connection to one of our favorite OSS adventurers or OSS connected writers and adventurers, Ernest Hemingway. According to one cocktail tale, and as they say, success has many fathers, well, so do most great drinks. According to one cocktail tale, the Bloody Mary was invented circa 1921 at Harry's New York Bar in Paris, which is still there, by bartender Ferdinand Pete Petiot. According to his 1975 obituary, Pete had been experimenting with vodka drinks after having been introduced to the Russian spirit in 1920. See, after the Russian Revolution of 1917, a lot of Russian nobility were flocking to Paris. And one of them was the Smirnov family, which brought with them their formula for making vodka. They eventually changed the name to Smirnoff, set up a factory or distillery in France, and vodka became relatively popular in Paris as early as 1920s. His original formula was 50-50 mixture of vodka and tomato juice. An American named Roy Barton suggested that he call the drink the bucket of blood after a favorite Chicago bar. Apparently the drink never caught on in Harry's New York Bar in Paris. By 1934, right after Prohibition, Pete Petiot had come to the St. Regis and set up shop there, and he brought the drink along with him. The name Bucket of Blood was a little too bloody for the St. Regis management, so they encouraged him to change the name to the Red Snapper, which remained for a few years. Then it reverted to the Bloody Mary. But you still see Red Snapper on craft cocktail menus around the world. Now, in previous toasts, I've talked about Ernest Hemingway and the Paris Ritz Bar and how Hemingway and his cohorts with the French Resistance and the OSS liberated the Paris Ritz Bar from the Nazis as the Allies were reclaiming Paris in August of 1944, excuse me. Papa was actually very fond of the Bloody Mary served at the Ritz Bar by bartender Bertin Asimov. In fact, Hemingway made the bar at the Paris Ritz his headquarters and spent many hours there prior to going to the racetracks around Paris. And Hemingway's strategies in picking the horses were conducted, quote, under the profound inspiration of Bertin's Bloody Marys. In fact, Bertin claimed that he invented the Bloody Mary and named that drink after Hemingway's fourth wife, Mary. Not true, but it's a great story. What is true is that after the war in 1947, Hemingway shared his own personal Bloody Mary recipe with his friend Bernard Peyton, and the recipe goes like this. To make a pitcher of Bloody Marys, parentheses, any smaller amount is worthless. So I think he was getting ready for the debates as well. Take a good sized pitcher and put in it as big a lump of ice as it will hold. So I have these craft cocktail ice cubes. They're very large, but Hemingway used to make ice cubes using tennis ball cans. So he ended up with these big slugs of ice. So mix a pint of good Russian vodka. I'm going to use a half a pint. Because, mix a pint of good Russian vodka and an equal amount of chilled tomato juice. Add a tablespoonful of Worcester sauce. He refers to it as Worcester sauce. A little bit of Worcestershire sauce. And an equal, and add a jigger of fresh squeezed lime juice. So then add small amounts of celery salt, cayenne pepper, black pepper. So celery salt, you're talking about a local favorite, Old Bay, indispensable in a Bloody Mary. A little bit of cayenne pepper, a little bit of black pepper. Keep on stirring it, Hemingway writes, and taste it to see how it is doing. If it gets too powerful, weaken with more tomato juice. If it lacks authority, add more vodka. Some people like more lime than others. For combating a really terrific hangover, increase the amount of Worcestershire sauce, but don't lose the lovely color. Keep drinking it yourself to see how it is doing. Hemingway then claimed, I introduced this drink to Hong Kong in 1941, and I believe it did more than any other single factor, except perhaps the Japanese Army, to precipitate the fall of the Crown Colony. After you get the hang of it, you can mix it so it will taste as though it had absolutely no alcohol of any kind in it. And a glass of it will still have as much kick as a really good big martini. The whole trick is to keep it very cold and not let the ice water it down. So here you have the Bloody Mary a la Ernest Hemingway. And of course, the good old Bloody Mary is something like a blank canvas to drink makers. You can garnish it as you want. You can season it as you want. So I'm just going to keep it very simple. I like to use, these are marinated string beans. You find these in New Orleans at the Columns Hotel and their Bloody Marys. Go see my friend Gina Chersavani at Union Market at Buffalo and Bergen. She'll garnish your Bloody Mary with a lox and bagel sandwich. It's amazing. So anyway, let's raise a glass. Let's tip our glasses to the tip of the spear. Maybe put this one in the fridge or put the whole pitcher in the fridge. But enjoy the discussion this evening on the future of intelligence. And cheers to you all. Cheers to the Special Operations and Special Forces community, the OSS, and the United States of America. Cheers.
Thank you, Phil. No one will ever accuse OSS of standing for oh so sober. It's now my honor to welcome Dr. Michael Vickers, who will be our moderator this evening. Dr. Vickers' career as a special operator, a CIA operations officer, a national security policymaker, and intelligence community leader has spanned the last 2 decades of the Cold War through a decade and a half of our war with Al-Qaeda and its offshoots, service that saw unprecedented senior tenure across Republican and Democratic administrations. Most recently, Dr. Vickers served as the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence, exercising authority, direction, and control over the National Security Agency, the Defense Intelligence Agency, the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, the National Reconnaissance Office, the Defense Security Service, and the intelligence components of the military services and combatant commands. He's received the nation's highest awards in the fields of intelligence and defense, including the Presidential National Security Medal. He holds a PhD from Johns Hopkins University, an MBA from the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania, and a BA from the University of Alabama. He's written a memoir that will be published by Knopf, Penguin Random House early next year. He currently serves as an executive vice president at In-Q-Tel, a principal with the Telemus Group, a senior advisor to the Boston Consulting Group, a senior fellow at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies as an honorary chair of the OSS Society, and on several corporate, nonprofit, and government boards. Dr. Vickers meets the criteria for what was described as an ideal OSS candidate, a PhD who can handle himself in a bar fight. But thanks to the virtual nature of tonight's event, I'm confident there will not be any bar fights. So please welcome Dr. Vickers.
Thank you, Charles. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the fourth in our series of OSO Social Conversations. This evening, we will discuss the future of intelligence with my close friend and former colleague, Michael Morell. Over the course of a 33-year career with CIA, Michael rose from entry-level analyst to deputy director and acting director. He spent the first half of his career as an economic analyst and manager of teams, groups, and offices of analysts, principally focused on East Asia and the Pacific. The second half of his career was largely consumed by the global threat posed by Al-Qaeda and U.S. counterterrorism operations, though he had important global responsibilities overseeing the collection and production of intelligence on Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, Iran, China, Russia, North Korea, the Middle East, and other top-tier intelligence priorities, in addition to overseeing several major covert action programs. He served as executive assistant to Director George Tenet, as briefer to President George W. Bush, as chief of the president's analytical staff, as our senior analytic representative to British intelligence, as associate deputy director of CIA, as deputy director of intelligence, now the director of analysis, and finally as deputy director of CIA and twice its acting director. He was with President Bush on 9/11 and with President Obama for the raid that brought justice to Osama Bin Laden. We spent many an hour together in the White House Situation Room deliberating policy as members of the NSC's Deputies Committee and traveled frequently together to overseas hotspots. Michael's a graduate of the University of Akron, hasn't quite made the Oslo Social list yet, but he received a master's in economics from Georgetown University. His memoir, The Great War of Our Time, the CIA's Fight Against Terrorism from Al-Qaeda to ISIS, was published in 2015. Michael, it's a great pleasure to welcome you to the OSO Social Conversation Series.
Thanks, Mike. It's great to be with you. It's great to be with everybody. Can't think of anybody I'd rather have this conversation with than you. And it's going to be tough to follow Philip, isn't it?
Yeah. All right. Well, before we discuss the future of intelligence, let's reflect a bit on your 33-year career and how intelligence changed during those decades. So what motivated you to want to join the CIA?
Yeah, it's a little bit of an interesting story. So I was a lower middle class kid from Akron, Ohio. My dad was an auto worker. My mom was a homemaker. And I went to the local college, couldn't afford to go anywhere else, lived at home. And when I went to college, I wanted to be a lawyer, like so many young people at that time. And so I decided to major in political science. And the first semester, I took a class in economics because one economics class was required for a political science degree. And I fell in love with economics. And so I switched my major. Took a bunch of economics classes, really thought, and still think actually, that economics not only explains the economy, but explains pretty much of all human behavior as well. So my goal at when I became a senior in college was to go to grad school, get a PhD, and teach at the university level. That's what I wanted to do. I applied to a bunch of PhD programs. I got into a number of them, including University of Chicago, where all my kids would end up going someday. But I had a professor who I think did some work for the CIA. He died early in life, so I was never able to have a conversation with him about it, but he encouraged me to send an application. So I did for him. He and I had a pretty close relationship. And I get invited to Washington. And being this lower middle class kid from Akron, Ohio, I had never been to Washington, D.C. before. So I decided I am going to go to interview with the CIA, not because I wanted to work there, but because I get this free trip to Washington, see our nation's capital. Because I'd already decided that I was going to Chicago to study economics. So I go and I have 10 interviews over 2 days, and I was blown away by the mission of doing something bigger than yourself. I was blown away by the mission of keeping the country safe. I was blown away by the capabilities that they were able to talk to me about, and it was obviously quite limited, but they were able to talk to me about some. But most important, I was blown away by the people. I was blown away by, you could just feel the sense of dedication, the sense of commitment, the sense of family. You could just feel it. And the second day, the 5 set of interviews on the second day, everybody said to me, you know, this grad school thing that you keep on talking about and how important that is to you, if you come work here, we will send you to a master's program at night as soon as you start working. And if things go well for you, we will send you back to school full time to work on your PhD in economics, and we'll pay your tuition and we'll pay your salary during that time, which they did 5 years later. So, you know, I never looked back. I said yes, and I never looked back. And that's how I ended up there. Now, you know, I think I was so relaxed in those interviews because I really wasn't interested in a job that it probably helped a little bit.
Well, lucky for our country that you did. To our audience, I've described Michael as the Bob Gates of his generation, and you'll hear from Secretary Gates next week. And I don't know that he'll tell you this, but when he was a graduate student at Indiana University, he went to Washington to be interviewed by the CIA for the same reasons Michael did, mainly a free trip to Washington, and then stayed on. So they have a lot in common. So we talked a little bit about what you did there in the first half of your career, but maybe you can elaborate a bit on how you rose up the analytical ranks and kind of the general things you worked on.
Sure. So I'm an economics major, right? So I'm an economic analyst when I first show up. And I spend about 2.5 years doing working on energy issues. This was the second oil crisis. Iran-Iraq war, right, was underway. And so oil prices had skyrocketed again. Energy was a big deal. So I was with a team doing a whole range of energy issues. The big issue that I worked on at that time was, you'll remember, Mike, that the Soviets wanted to sell natural gas to Western Europe, right? Yeah. They wanted to build two gas pipelines, and they needed GE turbines in order to do that. And so President Reagan had to make a decision about whether he was going to authorize the sale of these turbines or not for this gas project. And so my role was to figure out how dependent Western Europe would be on Soviet gas 10 years out, 20 years out, 30 years out. So I had to look at both the demand for Western gas, for gas in Western Europe, and then the potential supplies and how much the Soviets would supply of that, and what West European dependence would be. So, you know, it's kind of an important thing for a young analyst to work on. Went right into the decision, right, that the president made, which I think is a great example of the level of responsibility that you get in the intelligence community very early in a career. So after doing that for 2.5 years, I went to work on East Asia, and I did a variety of things in East Asia, both as an analyst and then as a manager of analysts. So I worked on Southeast Asia. I worked a lot on Japan. I worked a lot on North Korea, and I worked a little bit on China. But I worked on East Asia probably the first 15, 16 years of my career. So half of my career was spent on East Asia. And that's where I learned how to be a manager and be a leader for the first time. I was an analyst for 9 years, and then I became a manager. And then at that point, I started a series of staff jobs. So my first staff job was as head of the president's daily brief. So the head of the team that put that document together every night, reviewed the pieces, made sure that they made solid arguments, made sure that they were well written, made sure that they were sourced well, made sure that they all kind of looked and felt the same, and get them coordinated and all that kind of stuff. Did that for 2 years, where my view of the world, right, expanded from just East Asia to everything, right, to everything we were telling the president every day. So my vision of the world expanded significantly. I did that for 2 years, and then I got probably the funnest job in my career, which was being George Tenet's executive assistant. Yeah. Well, you remember at the time he was the DCI, right? So he was the head of CIA, but also the head of the intelligence community. So all of a sudden I get this window, right? This window that I had into just analysis now becomes a window into everything CIA does. So collection and covert action, and then a window into everything the IC does as well. So I really got, I really got a deep understanding of everything the intelligence community does. But most important, I watched somebody who was a magnificent leader lead, and I learned a lot from George about how to bring other people along, how to get people to want to go up a hill and follow you, and I think that was really important. I then went back and did a little bit of work on counterterrorism and a little bit of work on East Asia, but it was a very short period of time on both, because George asked me to be George W. Bush's first intelligence briefer. And you don't say no to that, right? That's next to being the head of analysis. That's the second best job on the analytic side of the agency, briefing the president every day. So I was with President Bush every day from January 4th, 2001 to January 4th, 2002, 6 days a week, no matter where he was in the world, whether it was the Oval Office, whether it was Camp David on the weekends, whether it was his ranch in Texas, or traveling domestically or traveling overseas. The briefing in the Oval Office was scheduled for a half hour every day, but it would routinely go 45 minutes or an hour. The briefings on Saturdays would sometimes go 2.5 hours, because the president had so many questions. Then I went overseas, as you said. I went overseas for 3 years, which my wife will tell you was the best 3 years of our lives. After working those crazy hours for the president, I went to work overseas. Came back as the number 3 at CIA to Mike Hayden, running the kind of business side of the agency, IT, security, HR, all that kind of stuff. I'll be really honest with you, I didn't like that job because it wasn't substance, right? It wasn't the substance of what's going on in the world. And then from there to be the head of analysis at CIA for first Mike Hayden and then Leon Panetta, and then to be the deputy director under Leon and Dave Petraeus and John Brennan.
So let's look back at the big picture of those decades, and then we'll delve into your last decade and a half. So the 1980s were a real exciting period for CIA as we waged our final battles and showdown with the Soviet Empire. Looking back, as a senior intelligence officer and policymaker, what lessons do you think that decade holds for U.S. foreign policy today as we enter a new period of great power competition?
So I think the lesson, right, is more about policy than it is about intelligence. It's about understanding what the threat is to the nation and reacting to it, and putting in place the right policies to defend ourselves and ultimately to be able to claim victory. I think it was tremendous leadership in the 1950s, 1960s about pushing back on the Soviet Union and everything that they were doing, right? But also where appropriate and where in our interest negotiating with them, right? And it was the combination of both of those things that led us to win the Cold War. So I think it's a lesson about leadership in the world, confronting the threats and challenges you face as an entire nation, And I think it holds a lot of lessons for how we have to approach the challenge posed by China, which I'm sure we'll talk about.
Yeah. So in the late 90s, after the East Africa bombings, Director Tenet declared war on Al-Qaeda, but didn't get sufficient traction within the Clinton administration. You had a bird's eye view on these developments. Looking back, why did our early counterterrorism efforts fail? And why didn't the Clinton administration and then the first months of the Bush administration take more decisive CT action before 9/11?
Yeah, so this is a huge question. So I think some context is important here. CIA was the first organization to pay attention to Al-Qaeda. CIA was the first organization to be deeply concerned about Al-Qaeda. CIA was the first organization to warn about Al-Qaeda. People don't remember this, but in 1996, we made a judgment that he was not just a financier of terrorism, he was actually the head of a group of terrorists, that their intent was to attack US interests, including the homeland, that their intent was to drive the United States out of the Middle East, and their intent was to remove what they saw as US puppets in charge of Sunni governments in the Middle East. We also learned as early as 1996 that they wanted to get their hands on weapons of mass destruction. So we were saying all this, right, really early. And George Tenet of all the people was probably the most concerned about where this was going. George would frequently write personal memos to President Clinton about his concern. He wrote personal memos, personal letters to the head of OMB and to President Clinton about the need for more resources to be able to put against this target. Remember, the 1990s was a time when resources were going down in the intelligence community. Right? The number of staff officers at CIA fell by 25% from 1991 to 2001. I remember at one point in the ops course at the farm, there were only 5 or 6 people graduating a year. Just remarkable, right? And so in this declining resource environment, George is begging for more resources to deal with this growing threat. And then East Africa happens. And there's a US response, but it's essentially a slap on the wrist, right? A few dozen cruise missiles into the desert and a mistargeting of a pharmaceutical plant in Sudan, and then there's the bombing of USS Cole in 2000, and the Clinton administration starts to pay very close attention and starts to come to the same conclusion that George Tenet had come to about the seriousness of this threat. And Sandy Berger asked the CIA to put together a plan to go after Al-Qaeda. And this is now known as the famous Blue Sky Memo. So what Sandy Berger said to George was, if resources are no constraint and you have all the authorities that you would want, how would you go after this organization to degrade it? And this Blue Sky Memo then becomes the plan that gets implemented right after 9/11. So to the question of why the Clinton administration didn't do more, I don't know the answer to that. In terms of the Bush administration, I think it takes every administration a while to understand what the threats are. And remember, when the Bush folks were in government before, everybody was focused on nation states as a threat. And they had missed the rise of non-state actors, right? They weren't there for the rise of non-state actors. So it was this idea that this ragtag group of guys in Afghanistan could pose such a significant threat. They took a while to get their arms around. But let me say this in sum to your question. I think 9/11 was, yes, an intelligence failure in that we and the National Security Agency did not get inside of the Al-Qaeda senior leadership to know what they were planning. as you know, as we did after 9/11 time and time and time again, and stopped plot and plot after plot and attack after attack, we didn't do that on 9/11. So yes, tactical intelligence failure, strategic intelligence success in terms of warning, right, that these guys are coming after us. But it was also a policy failure. Yeah. I think the Clinton administration could have done more, and I think the Bush administration should have done more earlier. But it was also, Mike, it was also a national failure. People don't remember this, but Vice President Al Gore ran a commission on aviation safety, and there was a chapter on aviation security in that commission report, and it made a number of recommendations, and none of those, including hardening cockpit doors, including ramping up the inspection of bags coming on aircraft, everything that was put in place after 9/11 was recommended in this commission report. And the airlines pushed back on those recommendations when they were made at the time, because they didn't think the passengers would be willing to put up with the inconvenience of all of those things. So intelligence failure, yes. Policy failure, yes. National failure as well.
So let's turn to another intelligence failure, Iraq weapons of mass destruction, which is a searing experience for CIA. What caused that failure, and what lessons did CIA take from that experience?
So yeah, so I was the number 3 on the analytics side of the agency at the time. So I'm in the chain of command for this failure, right? So I'm gonna have to live with that the rest of my life. So I think the first thing I'd say, and this doesn't get enough attention, is this was first a collection failure. So what Saddam had done, as you know now, right? What Saddam had done was stop his programs with the intent that Western intelligence agencies, namely the CIA in his mind, he told us this later, would see that he had stopped them, and therefore the sanctions on him would be removed. And in his mind, he was going to restart his programs after sanctions had been removed. But he didn't want the Iranians to know that he had stopped the programs. So he didn't tell anybody, and he actually pretended that these programs continued. So what we picked up, right, were a lot of historical data, and we picked up a lot of what he wanted us to see, like meeting with his nuclear scientists, right? So first, this is a collection failure. For both CIA and NSA, we didn't get inside his inner circle. So same kind of failure as 9/11. So there's a collection piece to this that nobody ever talks about. Okay, then there's an analytic failure. And the analytic failure for me, and I think this is really important, the analytic failure for me is not the judgment that the analysts came to. It's the confidence level that they didn't express. So if I brought into a room all of the intelligence that the analysts had, and I let a group of students go through it or a group of professors go through it, they would come to exactly the same conclusion that the analysts came to, because that's where the data took you. And there was a lot of it. There was a lot of data. But what they didn't do was say, we do think he has chemical weapons. We do think he has a biological weapons production capability. We do think he is reconstituting his nuclear weapons program, and we do think he's building ballistic missiles. By the way, that was the only one we got right. But what's really important, Mr. President, what you really need to know is that we only have low confidence in those first three things, and we only have low confidence in those first 3 things because most of the data is prior to 1998, right? This is the fall of 2002, and most of the data was pre-1998 when UNSCOM got kicked out of the country, when the UN weapons inspectors got kicked out of the country. Most of the data was circumstantial. There was very little direct evidence, and a lot of the newer evidence came from the Kurds, which had an incentive, right, to make Saddam look like a bad guy. So had we really thought through the confidence level, we would have said, yeah, we think this, but what you need to know, Mr. President, is it's only low confidence. And so what did we learn from that? We learned that we learned that, and policymakers learned that those confidence levels in an analytic judgment are every bit as important as the analytic judgment itself. And as you know, today, almost every judgment has a confidence level attached to it, low, medium, or high, and that people inside the intelligence community understand that. They speak that language, and policymakers understand it as well, right? You'll remember when Bashar al-Assad in 2012 used sarin gas against his own people. For the first 6 months, we were at low confidence because we didn't know we didn't have proof, right, that he had ordered it. And there was some suggestion that maybe the opposition had used it to try to make him look bad. So we were at low confidence, and it took us a while to move up that scale. So that was a major, that was probably the worst moment, I think, in history for the intelligence community. But we also learned, I think, some very important lessons from it.
So let's move on to another circumstantial intelligence case, but this one resulted in a great intelligence success and policy success, the Osama Bin Laden operation. You and I played significant roles in that. Tell us why you supported it, what your confidence level was that UBL was actually in that compound, and your role.
Yeah. So let me tell you the thing I remember the most. So Director Panetta and I first heard about this in August of 2010. So as you know, we had a 3 times a week meeting with our counterterrorism center in the director's conference room, and it was called the small group, but you'll remember there was 40 or 50 people crowded into that room, so it wasn't really small. But they would brief us on everything going on the counterterrorism front. And at the end of one of those meetings in August, the head of that center said to Director Panetta and me, I need to see you two, just the two of you. So we went back to the director's office. It was the head of the counterterrorism center and a couple of his officers, the director and I, and Jeremy Bash, the director's chief of staff. And I remember one of the CTC guys said, we found a guy named Ahmed AlKuwaiti. And that name meant nothing to Director Panetta or to me. So they walked us through the history of this guy, possible courier for Bin Laden. Then they showed us satellite photographs, satellite imagery of this compound, right? And pointed out all of its interesting characteristics, right? 12 to 18-foot walls topped with barbed wire, sectioned off, multiple gates to get into the compound, a main house that had very few windows, a main house that had a balcony with a privacy wall. And I remember Director Panetta saying, why would somebody put a privacy wall in a balcony? Isn't the whole point of seeing out? Yeah. I remember, Mike, that at that meeting, nobody said the words Bin Laden might be there, but the hair on the back of my neck stood up. And so they told us that they were going to do some more collection, and they'd get back to us in a couple of weeks. And in a couple of weeks, they came back to us and they said, we've learned some things about this compound. So we looked at it before, and now we've learned some things about it. We learned that Abu Ahmed lives there with his brother Abrar, that they together purchased it, and that neither one of them had any known income. They had expanded the compound over time. The compound had no telephone, no Wi-Fi. The children in the compound didn't go to school, unlike the children in the rest of the neighborhood. They burned their trash rather than put it out for collection, like people in the rest of the neighborhood. So this is all circumstantial, right? This is all kind of what you're looking at and how interesting it is. It looks like somebody important is living there and being protected, and you've got this old intelligence that Abu Ahmed was a courier for Bin Laden before 9/11 and hung out with Khalid Sheikh Mohammed after 9/11. It's all you know. So we briefed this to President Obama at the end of September, so the next month. And he gives us 2 orders. He says, number 1, find out what the hell is going on inside that compound. And number two, don't tell anybody. Only the people in this room know this, nobody else. Not the Secretary of Defense, not the Secretary of State, not the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, nobody else. So we pull out all sorts of effort to collect more intelligence. And we really only learn a handful of additional things. We learn that there's a third family living there, and that third family never leaves the compound, and that the folks in the rest of the neighborhood don't know there's a third family there. And we assess that the number of women and the number of children in that third family is roughly what we think Bin Laden's family would look like at this point in his life. So we know that, we learn that. And we learn also that Abu Ahmed is still working for Al-Qaeda. You remember one of the questions we had, maybe he left Al-Qaeda a long time ago, but we learned through some good intelligence collection, not by CIA, but by another agency, that he was still working for Al-Qaeda. So it's still all circumstantial, right? So as you remember, somehow, and I think Leon, I think Director Panetta sort of had an expectation that I would kind of, pay attention to the analysis here. And I thought the analysts did a fantastic job. I mean, this was a circumstantial case, but they had learned the lessons from Iraq. They had done some red teaming. So one of the questions they asked themselves, Mike, was, what are all the other explanations here that fit the data that we have? So it's one exercise they did. Another exercise they did was they asked smart people outside of the Counterterrorism Center to look at all of the information and come back and tell them what they think. And these 4 people came back and said, we think Bin Laden's there, but we're not as confident as you are. So 2 red teams inside CIA. The lead analyst, the Maya, right, of Zero Dark 30, she was 95% confident, not 100% like in the movie, but she was 95% confident. The senior analytic manager in that part of the Counterterrorism Center was 80% certain, and I was only 60% certain. And you'll remember this famous moment in the sit room where people are throwing around these probabilities, and the president looks at Leon Panetta and says, "Why is everybody all over the map with these probabilities?" And Leon turns to me and says, "Michael?" And I quickly gather my thoughts and I say, "Mr. President, let me just start by saying it's not because people have different data, right? Rest assured, everybody's looking at the same set of data here. This isn't some situation where somebody's got data that somebody else doesn't." I said, "I think what's going on here is people are washing this data through their own experience." So the analysts here who came to CTC after 9/11 and have known nothing but success after success in taking bad guys off the battlefield and stopping attacks, stopping plots, they're washing it through that experience. And that's 80 to 95%. I'm at 60% because I'm washing it through my Iraq WMD experience, right?
Yes.
Situation, right? Circumstantial case. And then I say something that kind of rattles the room, right? I say, in fact, Mr. President, you need to know that the case that Saddam had weapons of mass destruction was a stronger case than Bin Laden being at Abbottabad. And you told me later that you could hear a pin drop in the room when I said,
Yeah, I was at 80, 85%, and I thought we were in trouble then, but
then he said to me, "So Michael, does this mean you wouldn't do this?"
Yeah.
And you remember I quickly said, "No, in fact, I would do this. This is the best intelligence we've ever had on him."
Yeah.
So absolutely, I would act on 60%.
Yeah,
and he would tell you, right? He would tell you later that it was a coin flip for him in terms of intelligence. And I remember this moment. It was just Director Panetta and I in his office right before the operation, and Leon said to me, "So Michael, what do you think?" And I said, "Leon, I won't be surprised if he's there, and I won't be surprised if he's not." And Leon said, "Me too."
Yeah.
So yeah.
Well, I remember Leon saying too, look, if you told the American people it's 50-50, they'd expect you to go. It was 48% higher than we had any point before that. So.
I also thought that John Brennan did something really important, and you'll remember this too. I think it was, we were doing daily deputies meetings, right? That last couple of weeks, every day. And at one of those deputies meetings, John said, let me just say something here because I want to be crystal clear about this. If we go and he's not there, this is not an intelligence failure. Yeah. They have made, the CIA has made very clear that this is a circumstantial case, right? Yeah. They've made that crystal clear. So if we go in there and he's not there, this is not an intelligence failure. I thought it was a very important thing to say.
Yeah. All right, let's shift now to future of intelligence, our main topic in the 20 minutes or so, 15, 20 minutes we have before we take audience questions. Before we get into specifics of intelligence, let's discuss the context that intelligence will have to operate, the evolving national security environment. So most national security analysts have described our world now as the return of great power competition with US-China competition at the forefront. And adding to that in complexity is a resurgent Russia waging information warfare and hybrid warfare and potentially escalate to de-escalate strategies in the event of open conflict. There's accelerating technological change ranging from automation, artificial intelligence, quantum technologies, and biotechnologies, pandemic diseases, we all know, and other challenges from globalization. And most importantly, in my opinion, the deterioration of our ability to come together as Americans. What do you see as our principal national security challenges in the decade ahead, particularly those relevant to how we might think about reshaping our intelligence enterprise?
Yeah, so let me give you an unconventional answer, and then I'll give you a conventional answer. So, and I think you and I both agree on this. In fact, you've already said it. I think the most important national security threat facing the United States is ourselves. Because at the end of the day, the most important determinant of a country's national security is the health of its politics, the health of its economy, the health of its society, right? So if we can't get things together, then it doesn't matter. Nothing else matters, right? It won't matter if we have the right China policy. It won't matter if we have the right policy towards North Korea or Iran. If we fail domestically, then we are not going to be a power in the world, and we're not going to be interested in playing a leadership role in the world. So that is the most important issue. From a more conventional perspective, without a doubt, right? I mean, you could list, right, the MAD 5, right? China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, extremism, right? But if you list those and you prioritize them, you put China at the top. Yeah. And not only do you put China at the top, but there is a big gap. There is a huge gap between China and everything else. So China is it, right? The relationship between Washington and Beijing is by far the most important relationship in the world for what the world's going to look like in 5, 10, 15, 20, 25 years. And it's the most important relationship, Mike, because the spectrum of possible outcomes in that relationship ranges from cooperation at one end of the spectrum, the kind of cooperation we saw between Barack Obama and Xi Jinping on climate change during Barack Obama's last year in office. Then you slide over a little bit to what I would call healthy competition, right? Market-based economic competition, international order-based diplomatic competition. Then you slide over a little further to what I would call unhealthy competition, Chinese stealing intellectual property, Chinese giving subsidies to their firms, US not allowing Chinese investment in the United States, US not allowing Chinese students in the United States. So you get this unhealthy competition, and then all the way on the far right side to conflict, right? To war. I'm not predicting war, but the probability is not zero, right? Probability exists that we will fight this nation someday. And so getting this right is going to be very, very difficult. We're already sliding far to the right here. We're sliding into what I would call a new Cold War. It's not, doesn't look like the old Cold War, right? Not based on nuclear throw weights and ideologies and proxy wars in Africa and Latin America, like he used to be involved in. It's competition based on the technologies of the future, which you mentioned earlier, and it's competition based on influence around the world. And we're going to have to, not only do we need to focus on China the way we focused on the Soviet Union as an intelligence community, and the way we focused on Al-Qaeda post 9/11, but we also have to focus on the right things. So what does that mean? I was talking to somebody yesterday, and I said to them, when I was deputy director, I could make a phone call, and within 5 minutes, I could have world-class collection and world-class analytic expertise around my conference room table on the Iranian nuclear program, or the North Korean nuclear program, or Chinese hypersonics, or traditional weapons, right? I'll bet you that Vaughn Bishop, the current deputy director of CIA, can't make a phone call and get world-class collection and world-class analytic expertise around his table on Chinese AI.
Yeah.
Right? And we're going to have to be able to do that in the future. So we're going to have to not only focus on China, but also focus on the right things.
Absolutely. So let's now turn to the future of intelligence. You and I have written about this, but it would seem before we get into capabilities and priorities and organization, it would seem that a first order requirement is to depoliticize intelligence and return it to its rightful place at the center of national security decision making. You agree?
Absolutely, and I think there's I think this is kind of like the first job of the next leadership of the IC. And I think there's three pieces to it. So one is fixing the relationship between the president and the intelligence community. And what it basically is listening to the intelligence community. It doesn't mean you need to agree, right? There are plenty of times that George Bush said to me, Michael, I don't agree with you. Or Barack Obama. Barack Obama didn't say it, but I could see him thinking it, right? So presidents don't have to agree; they just have to listen. And then it's even better when they interact, right? When they ask questions and they try to understand why you think what you think, right? And be open to changing their mind. I saw that in both President Bush and President Obama. But most important, it means when you disagree, not criticizing the intelligence community publicly, right? Not undermining them. And certainly not politicizing the intelligence community the way the current director of national intelligence is doing. So I think this one is actually easy to fix.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it requires the right president, it requires the right leadership of the intelligence community, and it simply requires the president of the United States to come to CIA or come to the ODNI and give a speech and say all the right things, right? Intelligence has never been more important than it is today. I'm gonna take my PDB every day. I'm gonna have a briefer. I'm gonna ask a lot of questions. I'm gonna respect the fact that it's your job to tell me things that I might not want to hear. And I understand that and I welcome it. There may be times when I challenge you, but it's from an intellectual basis, not from a political basis, right? I think that's easy to fix. The second thing is fixing the relationship with Congress. So there is very little trust in the two intelligence committees today for the leadership of the intelligence community. And that needs to be fixed. And I think whoever leads the intelligence community next needs to take a page from Leon Panetta's congressional relations playbook, which is tell them everything. Don't try to spin something. Don't try to make something look better than it is. Don't try to put lipstick on a pig. There were times, Mike, when I would go up there with CIA officers, and I'd watch those officers be more careful in what they said than in conversations they had with foreign liaison. And because they didn't want to be right, they didn't want to be the meat in a political sandwich. But when members of Congress and the staff see them do that, right, they think they're trying to hide something. And it creates this tension in the relationship. So Leon Panetta is the model here. Just Put it all on the table.
Yeah.
Nothing to hide, right? And then the third thing is the hardest in the relationship bucket. And that third thing is thanks to the rhetoric and actions of the current commander-in-chief, and I don't want to get political here, but thanks to the rhetoric and actions, and thanks to the actions of the current DNI, there are 42% of the American public that think the intelligence community is part of the deep state.
Yeah.
Who thinks the intelligence community does not exist to protect America, that it actually exists to undermine democracy. And that's not going to change with the defeat of the president. Right? That's still going to be there. So how does the new leadership of the intelligence community deal with the problem that almost half of America thinks we're the bad guys?
Yeah.
And I think that's a real challenge that somebody's going to have to figure out.
Yeah, absolutely. So things like artificial intelligence, the surveillance state as we see emerging in China are going to affect, our ability to collect secrets. Changes in the communications environment will affect it as well. There's also big changes going on in open source, and you've written in Foreign Affairs about the need for a separate open source agency. Do you still hold that view, and why do you?
Yeah, so let me just step back for a second and say those three relationships we just talked about is kind of a first bucket. A second bucket is technology.
Uh-huh.
So, my view is that the intelligence community needs to be at and to stay at the cutting edge of technology.
Yeah.
And we're not there today. In fact, we're falling further behind.
Yeah.
And we got to figure out how to get to the cutting edge and how to stay there. And I don't have the answer to that.
Yeah.
I just know where we have to get to, right? And there are three pieces to the technology story, I think. One is one we already talked about, is it's going to be the responsibility of the intelligence community to understand foreign technological capabilities, just the way it is our responsibility to understand traditional conventional weapon systems, right? And weapons of destruction. So we got to be able to do that. We got to have the collection capabilities on that, and we have to have the analytic expertise on that. So that's one slice. And then a second slice is, we conduct HUMINT and SIGINT using certain approaches, and those approaches are being made more difficult by technology. Right? So just think about how difficult it is to travel an alias with biometrics, right? It's darn near impossible, right? So the persistent, ubiquitous surveillance that now exists in certain places on the planet, really I think is an existential threat to HUMINT, right? And we're not just talking about HUMINT here, because as you know, some of the best SIGINT is human enabled. Right. So if HUMINT is threatened, then a chunk of SIGINT gets threatened too. So this is really important. So we're going to have to figure out how we continue to operate from a HUMINT perspective in a completely different environment. Yeah. And then the third piece of the technology story is how do we use technology to do our jobs better, both from a collection perspective and from an analytic perspective. And I think open source plays a role in the second two buckets, particularly the third. I think tremendous amount of intelligence information in open source. It just needs to be mined. And my concern, the reason why my co-author and I called for a new agency is that our view was that the open source enterprise is never going to get the resources it needs and the focus that it needs being inside the country's HUMINT agency. So shouldn't be inside CIA, should be its own thing. I think you can make an argument that it could be a government entity. I think you could make an argument that it be a kind of quasi-private government entity in some way. I think the private sector can do open source intelligence more cheaply and more effectively than the government can. So maybe there's a different model here. I don't know. But it is just, it is just becoming more important every day, both in challenging us in how we do our business and creating opportunities for how we can do our business.
So maybe one more question before we turn to the audience. We could talk about space and covert action or a range of things, but we'll see what the audience asks. Are there any major organizational or human capital reforms that you think we need to make given the evolving environment?
Yeah, so I'd say, it's a great question. I'd say we need to make sure that the DNI is empowered. Why? Because I think it's if we're going to get technology right, if we're going to get this open source question right, if we're going to if we're going to be able to do a lot of the things that you and I just talked about, we need to do them as a community, and that means the DNI needs to be empowered. And as you know, we've gone through a variety of DNIs. Some of them with a lot of influence, some of them with very, very little. The DNI, the various DNIs in the Trump administration did not have a lot of influence with the agencies. So I think we need a DNI who's empowered by the president to actually run the intelligence community.
Yeah.
And I think it's very important that the person that the president chooses to be the DNI be somebody who has stature.
Yeah.
Somebody who is seen as close to the president. The guy or gal who puts the intelligence on the table every day at the PDB meeting, or attends the PDB meeting, and the man or woman who puts the intelligence on the table at PCs and NSC meetings. We have to end this dueling briefings between the DNI and CIA, right? It's ridiculous. So I think it's really important that the DNI have a tremendous amount of influence. I can't remember, this is going to be a surprise to everybody, but I can't remember a single time where the DNI called a meeting and the director of CIA actually went. Right? The CIA always sends a lower level individual to one of those meetings, either the deputy director or the executive director. We need a DNI who has so much stature that when he or she calls a meeting, the director of CIA actually goes.
Yeah, I agree. So let's turn to audience questions now. I got them on my cell phone here. One of them relates to the comments you made about why you went to CIA and your professor in your undergraduate studies seeing a potential for you in this. What traits generally, let's talk CIA in particular, do we look for in a potential analyst or a potential operations officer? You and I have discussed this a lot in the past. Informative for our audience, I think, if you.
I literally have this conversation like 4 times a week with students. So it's great. It's a great question. So as you know, the skill sets are completely different, right? So the skill sets that they look for in terms of an analyst, number 1, critical thinking skills, right? The ability to think through a problem logically, critically, skeptically, etc. Number 2, written and oral communication skills. Number 3, what I would call intellectual curiosity.
Yeah.
What does that mean? It means that you want to understand a problem in all of its depth and all of its complexity, right? Those are the must-haves. That's what they look for. And then, having regional studies after that, foreign travel, language are kind of nice to haves. But if you don't have those first 3 things, you're not going to get hired. You're just not. By the way, I think the reason why my professor saw in me the potential is because economics teaches, at the end of the day, critical thinking skills. It is one of the disciplines that actually teaches you to think critically. On the ops side's really interesting, right? Number 1, off the charts interpersonal skills, right? Number 2, off the charts emotional intelligence skills, so that when you're having a conversation with somebody, you know what they're thinking, even though they haven't told you, right? By their body language, by look in their face, by tone of their voice, right? You just know what they're feeling and thinking. Number 3, and this is going to sound really weird, is confidence to the point of overconfidence.
Yeah.
And people will say, well, why is that a hiring trait? And the answer is because sitting across the table from another human being and having a conversation about them committing espionage against their own country or against their own group is probably the hardest conversation you'll ever have, right? And if you don't have a ton of self-confidence, you're not going to go anywhere near that conversation. So self-confidence is really important. Now, it makes people on that side of the agency a little bit more difficult to manage, because it's not just Lake Wobegon where everybody thinks they're above average. It's literally everybody thinks they're in the top 10%.
Yeah.
But you don't want them to lose that, right? Because it is necessary for them to do their jobs. And then 4th is the ability to learn a foreign language, right, in a decent amount of time, because you get moved around. So those are the 4 things on the ops side. But you can see completely different, right? And I probably ran into literally less than 10 people in my career who could operate effectively on both sides of the agency.
Yeah.
I could never have been an ops officer, never.
You got pretty good ops instincts, but anyway. So related to this is a question on looking back on your career, someone starting out in intelligence, what do you wish you knew when you started out that you didn't know, or what advice would you give in general to someone starting out, embarking on a career in intelligence?
Yeah, so I think the best piece of advice I ever got, which came a little late, was don't just look up the ladder. Look across different ladders, right? Don't be afraid of moving. Don't be afraid of moving horizontally, right? Don't only think about moving vertically. And so looking back at my career, I wish I would have done, for example, some overseas assignments when I was an analyst. And this person, I'll just say who, Winston Wiley, when he was the head of analysis at CIA, he and I were on a TDY together, and we spent a lot of time talking. And I remember him telling me this, giving me this advice, right? Don't just focus on going up the ladder. He said, one of the things he said in that conversation, which is absolutely true, is he said, when you retire, the jobs that you're really going to remember are the offline jobs. Right? You're going to remember that you were the head of the PDB staff. You're going to remember that you were George Tenen's executive assistant. You're going to remember that you were George Bush's briefer. Those are the jobs you're really going to remember. You're not going to remember what job you had, as an analytic manager in, the early 1990s. And he's absolutely right about that. So, be willing to move wherever they want you to go and do whatever they want you to do. And don't try to be planned about what your career is going to look like.
So I don't know how much we can say about this question, but there's a couple about the future of covert action and specifically the Special Activities Center. So what are your thoughts on every president since Truman has resorted to covert action in one form or another. What's your thoughts on the future of that discipline?
Yeah, so look, I think this is a really important issue. My general view, and you and I have talked about this, I don't know, hundreds of times. My general view is that CIA does too much covert action. CIA is too quick to say yes to a president who's asking for the CIA to undertake covert action. Presidents tend to do that when they don't have any other options.
Yeah.
And my view is that CIA should be open to covert action when you really believe that you can make a difference to the policy objective, right? All these covert actions have a policy objective, and I think if you fundamentally believe that you're not capable of moving the needle on that policy objective, you should push back and say, we don't think we can make a difference here. So that's one. Two is that you actually have the capability to carry it out, right? So, a good example of us not having the capability to carry something out was the detention and interrogation program. We had never been in the detention and interrogation business, right? We didn't have that skill set. The military had that skill set. We did not have it. And then third, that you can keep it secret, right? It by law, it has to be kept secret. So if you can't keep it secret, then you shouldn't be doing it. If I go back, Mike, and think about, there were 13 covert actions when I was deputy director,
Right.
and you were read into all of them. And I think you would agree with me in my saying that some of them were off the charts effective at meeting their policy objective. And some of them didn't even come close to meeting the policy objective. So I probably could have, based simply on, were we moving the policy needle, I probably could have chopped off 4 or 5 of them. So why is this important? This is important because Congress gives you additional funds for covert action, usually, not always, but usually, but they don't give you additional people. So when you start a new covert action, you take your operators, mostly, sometimes you take some analysts, and you take them from what they were doing in terms of collection or analysis, and now have them do covert action. So there is an opportunity cost. And not only does it take just people in general, but it often takes your best people. Your best people are attracted to some of these covert action programs because they're so consequential, they're so sexy. You see the results, right? It's harder to see the results when you're simply collecting FI or you're doing analysis.
Guilty as charged.
Right, absolutely, all of us, right? And it also takes the focus and the time of the leadership of the organization, right? So I often used to think, what if we had spent 3 times a week, instead of with the counterterrorism guys talking about what they were doing, if we spent 3 times a week talking about Russia collection and China collection and Iran collection, right? How much better would we have been collecting on those targets had the leadership of the organization spent as much time on those? So I think we got to be very careful in saying yes to covert action. I think we got to be sober about it. We are a can-do organization. So somebody says, do this, we say, yes, sir. And I think we have to explain to a president when he or she asks for covert action, to explain the opportunity cost. I mean, there's no doubt in my mind that CIA's paramilitary focus on Al-Qaeda after 9/11 played a role in us not having the collection that we needed on Russia in 2016 and the intelligence that we need on China today. The HIPC just came out with a public report on the IC's China collection, and it was not a pretty picture.
Yeah, so I would agree. You divide these things into some that are shoring up an ally. They may be good for the relationship. They may help on defense. They're not going to have dramatic results. The more offensive programs, you really have hits or misses. Some of them are really Hail Mary passes and have no chance of success. Others, when they're successful, really are extraordinary capabilities for the country, but they're fairly rare. And usually they tend to be the bigger programs that still preserve a veil of secrecy, but take advantages of scale to be so effective. And I know some of the ones I'm referring to.
Yep.
Well, with that, Michael, it's been an extraordinary conversation. I really thank you for joining us in this tonight. I guess the debate is 32 minutes away, so I hope everybody has their Bloody Mary ready, and I'll turn it over to you, Charles.
Thank you. Thank you. I'd like to, there we go. Hold on one second. There we go. There we go. I'd like to thank Dr. Vickers and Mike Morrell for sharing their time and insights with us tonight and for their selfless service to our nation. And I'd also like to thank our series sponsor, Fiserv, and our event sponsors, BCG, Incatel, and Signal Labs. Phil Green will be back next week with a drink he created in 2017 to commemorate the OSS's creation. It's called the OSS 75. And check the Eventbrite details page for the drink's recipe. For our last event in the series, we have a tremendous lineup planned. Dr. Vickers will speak with Secretary Robert Gates, Secretary Leon Panetta, General David Petraeus, and Admiral William McRaven. We're calling the discussion OSS 75, Its Legacy and Lessons. And to learn more about the OSS Society, please visit osssociety.org, where you can download a membership application form. When you join, you will receive an OSS Society membership card, a replica of General Donovan's OSS ID card, as you can see on your screen. And because General Donovan was 109, everybody in the society is also 109. When we sent these cards out to our members many years ago, I remember that one of the veterans, OSS veterans, sent it back complaining that that wasn't his picture. Because we can't hold the Donovan Award dinner this year, we'd like to close the evening by showing you Warrant Officer Nicholas Lavery's acceptance speech from last year's Donovan Award dinner when he received the Peter Ortiz Award that was presented to him by General Francis Bodette, the USASOC commander. And I'm also proud to announce that Nick has agreed to serve as our museum's ambassador to the Special Operations community. So again, thank you for joining us tonight. We hope to see you next week. And I know you will enjoy hearing about Nick's incredibly courageous journey and his really very powerful acceptance speech. Thank you.